He thought silence meant control, but tonight, silence was the sound of 3 children being forgotten. The mansion stood still under the weight of polished marble and dim golden light, a place where every surface gleamed and every rule was obeyed without question, yet behind one closed door on the 3rd floor, something fragile was breaking apart minute by minute, the kind of quiet crisis that money, power, and reputation could not fix, and Aisha Carter felt it before she understood it, a sound that didn't belong in a house like this, thin and strained, like a cry stretched too long without comfort, echoing down the hallway as she stood with a linen cloth in her hand, frozen between duty and instinct, because she had been told on her first day, in a voice that carried no room for misunderstanding, that the nursery was off limits, that the children were not her concern, that in this house, you did your job and nothing more, and for 3 days she had followed that rule perfectly, moving like a shadow through rooms bigger than her entire apartment, keeping her eyes down, her voice quiet, her presence forgettable, because invisibility was safety, and safety meant she could keep sending money back to her mother, could keep paying off bills that never seemed to shrink, could keep surviving in a world that had never made space for someone like her. But tonight, survival felt like something else entirely, something closer to guilt, because the sound coming from behind that door wasn't just crying, it was exhaustion, the kind that came when a child had no one left to answer. And Aisha knew that sound in a way that lived in her bones, because years ago, in a small apartment that smelled of formula and fear, she had heard something like it before, and by the time help came, it had been too late, and that memory pressed against her chest now, tightening with every passing second, as the hallway stretched long and empty around her, no footsteps, no voices, no sign that anyone else was coming, the staff quarters silent, the security posted floors below, the woman of the house gone without explanation hours earlier, her absence hanging heavier than her presence ever had, and the rules still stood, clear and absolute, but the sound on the other side of that door didn't care about rules. It rose and fell in uneven waves, weaker now, thinner, as if even the strength to cry was slipping away, and Aisha's hand moved before her mind could stop it, hovering over the handle, trembling not from fear of punishment but from the weight of the decision itself, because stepping inside would change something, she could feel it, would cross a line that could not be uncrossed, and yet standing still felt worse, like choosing to look away, and she had spent too much of her life watching people look away, so slowly, almost as if the house itself might object. She turned the handle and pushed the door open, the room beyond dim and too quiet for what it should have been, soft blankets scattered, 3 small bodies tangled in a crib too large for how alone they seemed, their faces flushed, their breathing uneven, the kind of fragile stillness that followed too much crying and not enough comfort, and for a moment, Aisha just stood there, taking it in, the reality of it. The absence of anyone else, the truth that no one had come, and then something inside her settled, not calm, but certain, because whatever this house demanded, whatever consequences waited beyond this moment, none of it mattered more than what was in front of her now, and she stepped forward, setting the cloth aside, kneeling beside the crib as her hands reached in, careful, steady despite the tremor that still lingered in her fingers, lifting one child, then another, then the third, holding them close as if proximity alone could make up for hours of neglect, and the smallest of them stirred, a faint sound escaping his lips, not quite a cry anymore, just a whisper of need, and Aisha closed her eyes for half a second, grounding herself in the weight of them, in the warmth, in the simple undeniable truth that they were still here, still breathing, still waiting for someone to choose them, and tonight, for reasons she didn't have time to question, that someone was her. The first thing Aisha noticed was how light they felt for 3 children who should have been full and sleeping, their small bodies pressed against her as if holding on to the only steady thing in the room, and she adjusted her grip carefully, lowering herself onto the soft rug beside the crib. Because standing felt too unstable for what she needed to do next, her mind already moving faster than her fear, because instinct was louder now, sharper, guiding her hands as she checked each child one by one, gentle fingers brushing warm foreheads, listening to uneven breaths, noting the way their tiny fists opened and closed without strength, and she swallowed hard, recognizing the signs of hunger that had gone too long unanswered, the kind that drained energy until even crying became too much, and she looked around the room quickly, taking in the polished shelves lined with expensive toys, untouched bottles arranged perfectly on a side table, everything in place except the one thing that mattered, care, and that realization settled heavy in her chest, because this was not chaos, this was neglect wrapped in perfection, and she moved without hesitation now, shifting the smallest child into the crook of her arm while reaching for the prepared formula, her hands steady despite the quiet urgency that pulsed through her veins, because every second mattered in ways no one else in this house seemed to understand. And as she tested the temperature against her wrist, a habit she had not practiced in years but never forgot, a memory flickered through her mind uninvited: a dim kitchen, a crying infant, a clock that moved too slowly when it mattered most, and she pushed it aside, forcing herself back into the present because these children needed her here, not lost in what had already been taken from her. And the first child latched onto the bottle weakly, but it was enough, a small sign that they had not reached the point of no return, and Aisha let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her shoulders lowering just slightly as she adjusted the second child closer, balancing them with a care that came not from training but from something deeper, something that had always been there waiting for a moment like this. And the room began to shift, not physically, but emotionally, as the tension that had filled the air softened just enough to allow hope to exist alongside fear, and one of the children made a small sound, not a cry, not quite, but something softer, something that felt like relief, and Aisha's throat tightened as she continued, moving between them with quiet efficiency, offering what comfort she could, murmuring low words that did not need to be understood to be felt, because tone carried more than language ever could, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, their breathing began to even out, their bodies relaxing against her as if recognizing safety in a place where it had been missing for far too long, and she leaned back slightly against the side of the crib, careful not to disturb them, her own body finally registering the strain of holding all three at once, muscles trembling under the weight. But she did not shift away, did not loosen her hold, because letting go felt unthinkable now, and as the minutes passed, marked only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint sounds of the city far below, Aisha became aware of something else, something that sent a quiet chill down her spine, the absence of footsteps in the hallway, the absence of anyone checking, anyone asking, anyone coming to see if the children of this house were cared for, and it was that silence, more than anything else, that told her the truth she had not wanted to accept, that this was not a momentary lapse, not a simple mistake, but a choice made by someone who should have known better. And Aisha's grip tightened slightly, protective without thought, as she looked down at the three small faces now calmer, their features softening in sleep or something close to it, and she realized that whatever consequences waited outside this room, whatever rules she had broken, whatever questions would come, none of it could undo what had already been revealed tonight, because in a house built on power and control, three children had been left alone long enough for a stranger to become their only answer, and that was not something she could walk away from anymore. The moment the last child's breathing settled into something steady, something safe, Aisha allowed herself exactly 1 second to close her eyes, not to rest but to anchor herself, because she knew this fragile calm could disappear just as quickly as it had come, and when she opened them again, the room felt different, not quieter but heavier, as if the truth of what had happened here had fully arrived, pressing into every corner of the space, and she shifted slightly against the crib, adjusting her hold as the smallest of the three stirred, his fingers curling instinctively into the fabric of her uniform, gripping it with surprising strength for someone so exhausted, and that small, unconscious action sent a sharp wave through her chest, because it was not just a reflex, it was trust forming in real time, fragile and immediate, and she swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the three faces resting against her, each one so similar yet already distinct, their features softened now by the absence of distress, their tiny brows no longer furrowed, their lips no longer trembling with the effort of crying, and for the first time since she stepped into the room, Aisha felt something else beneath the urgency, something quieter but just as powerful, a sense of responsibility that went beyond the moment, because this was not just about getting them through one night, this was about what came after, and that thought lingered just long enough to make her glance toward the door, half expecting it to open, half expecting someone to finally notice what had been ignored for hours, but the hallway remained still, the silence outside unchanged, and that absence of interruption began to settle into something more unsettling, because in a house where every movement was monitored, where every action was accounted for, the lack of attention here was no longer accidental, it was deliberate, and that realization sharpened her awareness, making every small detail stand out, the untouched feeding schedule posted neatly on the wall, the digital monitor blinking quietly with no alerts triggered, the expensive rocking chair positioned perfectly yet unused, everything designed for care yet untouched by it, and Aisha's jaw tightened slightly as she shifted her weight again, careful not to wake them, her muscles aching now from holding all three, a strain that spread through her shoulders and down her arms, but she did not loosen her hold, did not consider placing them back into the crib, because the space they had been lying in just minutes ago no longer felt safe in the same way, and as if responding to that unspoken thought, one of the children made a soft sound, a faint murmur that barely registered as a cry but carried enough weight to pull her attention fully back, and she lowered her head slightly, her voice dropping to a gentle hum, a melody without words, something steady and rhythmic that filled the room. Just enough to replace the silence that had once been so heavy, and the effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable, the child's fingers relaxing slightly, his breathing evening out again, and Aisha felt it then, the shift that no rulebook could account for, the moment where care became connection, where presence became protection, and it grounded her in a way nothing else could, because whatever this house demanded of her, whatever role she had been hired to play, none of it defined what was happening now. This was something else entirely, something that did not belong to contracts or instructions, and as the minutes continued to pass, stretching quietly into something that felt almost suspended in time, Aisha became aware of another change, not in the children, not in herself, but in the atmosphere beyond the room, a faint vibration through the floor, distant at first but unmistakable, the sound of a car door closing somewhere below, followed by footsteps that did not carry the casual rhythm of staff but something more deliberate, more controlled, and her body reacted before her mind fully processed it, her spine straightening slightly, her grip tightening instinctively around the children as her eyes flicked once more toward the door, because even without seeing him, even without hearing his voice, she knew that presence, the kind that altered a space simply by entering it, and in that moment, the fragile peace she had created inside the nursery met the approaching weight of something far more powerful, something that would not ignore what it found on the other side of that door, and for the first time since she made her decision to step inside, Aisha felt the full consequence of it catching up to her, not as regret, but as a quiet, steady acceptance that whatever happened next, she would not let go. The sound reached the door before the man did, a measured set of footsteps that carried authority without needing to announce it, each step precise, unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone who was never questioned, and Aisha felt it ripple through her before she even looked up, her body instinctively bracing while her arms tightened ever so slightly around the three children, not out of fear for herself but out of a quiet, unspoken need to shield them from whatever was about to enter, and when the door finally opened, it did not swing wide or dramatic, it moved just enough, controlled, revealing a figure that filled the doorway not by size alone but by presence. Dominic Russo stood there, his silhouette framed by the dim hallway light, his expression unreadable in that first second, eyes adjusting to the softer glow of the nursery as they landed on a scene he had not expected, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the air recognized that something irreversible had just occurred. And Aisha did not move, did not attempt to stand or explain, because any sudden motion felt wrong in a space that had only just found stillness, and Dominic took a step inside, the door closing quietly behind him, sealing them all into that moment, his gaze sharp, deliberate, taking in every detail with the precision of someone used to reading situations before words were ever spoken, the untouched crib, the bottles no longer arranged, the woman on the floor holding his children as if they belonged in her arms, and something in his posture shifted, not visibly to anyone else perhaps, but enough for the tension in the room to deepen, and when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, the kind that did not need volume to command attention, asking a question that was not really a question at all, but a demand wrapped in restraint. Who allowed this? And Aisha felt the weight of it settle over her, not as intimidation but as a recognition of the line she had crossed, and still, she did not look away, her eyes meeting his for the first time since he entered, steady despite the quiet tremor that ran through her arms from holding the children for so long, and she answered with the only truth that mattered, no one, and the simplicity of it hung in the air, stripping away excuses, leaving only the reality of her choice, and Dominic's gaze flicked briefly to the children, noting their calm, their steady breathing, the absence of distress that should have been there given the condition of the room, and that contrast did not go unnoticed, because he had walked into chaos before, into situations that required immediate control, but this was different, this was the aftermath of something that had already been resolved by someone he had not authorized, and his attention returned to Aisha, sharper now, more focused, as if trying to place her within a system that did not account for this kind of action, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching not with uncertainty but with evaluation, each second adding weight to what would come next, and then one of the children stirred, a small movement, barely there, but enough to draw Dominic's eyes downward again, watching as tiny fingers tightened against the fabric of Aisha's uniform, holding on without waking, and something in that simple act disrupted the balance he had walked in with, because it was not fear, not distress, it was reliance, immediate and unquestioned, and he saw it, understood it in a way that bypassed logic entirely, and Aisha felt that shift even if she could not name it, the way his shoulders lowered just slightly, the way his gaze lingered not on her but on them, as if recalculating everything he thought he knew about what had happened in this room, and still, she did not move, did not offer further explanation, because the truth was already visible, written in the quiet, in the way the children remained close to her, in the absence of the panic he would have expected, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not softer, not kind, but different in a way that carried more weight than anger ever could. How long? And Aisha answered without hesitation, hours. And that word settled into the space between them, heavy with implication, stretching beyond the moment into everything that had led up to it, and Dominic did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting once more around the room, taking in the untouched systems, the silence of the staff, the absence of the one person who should have been here, and in that quiet assessment, something became clear, something that could not be undone, because this was no longer about a broken rule, it was about what the rule had allowed to happen. And as he stood there, looking at the woman who had chosen to act when no one else had, and the children who now rested because of it, the room did not just fall silent, it settled into a truth that neither of them could ignore. Dominic did not move right away, and that stillness carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Because it meant he was thinking, measuring, deciding, and Aisha felt that shift in the air like pressure before a storm, subtle but undeniable, her arms aching now from holding all three children yet refusing to release them, because something in her told her that letting go too soon would undo everything she had fought to stabilize, and the room held that fragile balance between authority and truth, between what should have happened and what had actually happened, and Dominic's gaze settled once more on the smallest child, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, the faint crease in his brow smoothing as sleep took hold, and for a moment, something unguarded flickered across his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but real enough to leave an imprint, because this was not a man unfamiliar with control, not a man accustomed to being absent when something under his roof demanded attention, and yet here he stood, confronted with the undeniable evidence that his control had not reached the one place it mattered most, and his jaw tightened slightly, not in anger toward Aisha, but in something deeper, something directed inward, as if recalculating the structure of a world he believed he understood, and when he finally stepped closer, the movement was slow, deliberate, not aggressive but intentional, closing the distance between them until he stood just a few feet away, close enough to see the exhaustion in Aisha's posture, the strain in her arms, the quiet determination that had not wavered since he entered, and for the first time, his attention shifted fully onto her, not as staff, not as background, but as someone who had made a decision in his absence that he could not ignore, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, not less controlled, but more focused, as if each word mattered more than the last. Why did you stay? And the question hung there, not accusatory, but searching, cutting through everything else to reach the one truth that defined the moment, and Aisha felt it settle in her chest, not as pressure, but as clarity, because there was no room here for anything but honesty, and she answered without looking away, because they needed someone, and the simplicity of it landed heavier than any explanation could have, because it removed every excuse, every justification, leaving only the undeniable fact that no one else had stepped in, and Dominic absorbed that in silence, his gaze dropping briefly to the children again, then returning to her, as if weighing the answer against what he was seeing, and for a long second, nothing else moved, not the air, not the light, not even the quiet hum of the room, until one of the children shifted slightly, a soft exhale escaping his lips as his head turned instinctively toward Aisha's chest, seeking warmth without waking, and that small, unconscious motion changed something, because Dominic saw it, saw the way the child settled immediately, saw the absence of fear, the absence of tension, and in that moment, the distance between what should have been and what was became impossible to ignore, and his shoulders lowered just a fraction, a subtle release that spoke louder than any admission, and when he reached out, it was not sudden, not forceful, but careful, his hand pausing just short of touching one of the children, as if testing whether his presence would disrupt the calm that had been created without him, and when the child did not react, did not pull away or tense, he let his fingers rest lightly against the soft fabric, a connection that seemed to ground him in a way nothing else had since he walked in, and Aisha watched that moment without speaking, understanding instinctively that this was not something she could guide or control. This was something he had to see for himself, and as the seconds passed, stretching into something quieter, more settled, Dominic withdrew his hands slowly, his gaze lingering on the children before lifting back to Aisha, and there was something different there now, not warmth, not yet, but recognition, the kind that changed how a person was seen from that point forward, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried that shift, subtle but unmistakable. "You should have called someone," and Aisha nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the rule she had broken, and then she answered just as simply, "There was no one," and that truth settled between them, final and unarguable, and Dominic did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to correct, only something to accept, and as he stood there, looking at the woman who had stepped into a role she was never given and the children who had responded to her without hesitation, the structure of authority in that room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would not return to what it had been before, and for the first time since he entered, Dominic Russo did not look like a man deciding what to do, but like a man realizing what had already been done. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore, it felt decided, as if something invisible had shifted into place without needing permission, and Aisha sensed it before Dominic spoke again, not through his words but through the way he remained there, not leaving, not dismissing her, not calling anyone else in to take over what she had already done, and that absence of command was its own kind of command, one that changed the rules without announcing it, and she adjusted her hold slightly. As the weight in her arms grew heavier with time, her muscles burning now in a steady, quiet way that she refused to acknowledge, because the children had settled fully, their breathing deep and even, their small bodies no longer tense, and she knew that placing them back into the crib too soon could undo that fragile stability, and for a moment, Dominic simply watched, not the room, not the surroundings, but her, the way she moved carefully to support all three at once, the way she shifted her weight without disturbing them, the way her focus never broke, and it was not something he was used to seeing, not like this, not from someone who had no obligation beyond the limits of her job, and that difference began to take shape in his mind, not as a question, but as a realization that could not be ignored, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not in volume but in tone, as if the edge had been set aside for something more deliberate. "Give them to me," and the words settled into the room with a weight that was not forceful but final, and Aisha felt the instinct to hesitate rise in her chest, not out of defiance, but out of protection, because for hours now, these children had known only her touch, her presence, her steadiness, and the thought of shifting that suddenly felt wrong in a way she could not fully explain, but she did not argue, did not resist, because she understood the position he held, the role he carried, and slowly, carefully, she began to move, guiding one of the children toward him with a caution that spoke louder than any warning, her eyes watching his hands, not questioning, but ensuring, and Dominic received the child with an unexpected gentleness, his movements measured, almost tentative, as if aware that any sudden change could break the calm that had been built without him, and when the small body settled against him without resistance, without waking, something in his expression shifted again, not visibly enough to name, but enough to register, because this was not control, this was trust, given without condition, and he held the child there for a moment, longer than necessary, as if grounding himself in the reality of it, before looking back at Aisha, and for the first time since he entered, there was no question in his gaze, no evaluation, only acknowledgment, and she passed the second child, then the third, each transfer done with the same care, the same quiet precision, until her arms were finally empty, the absence of weight almost disorienting after holding them for so long, and she lowered her hands slowly, feeling the tremor in them now that she no longer had to hide it, her shoulders dropping just slightly as the strain released, but she did not step back, did not leave, because something told her this moment was not finished yet, and Dominic stood there with all three children, adjusting his hold instinctively, finding a balance that was not perfect but steady enough, his posture no longer rigid, no longer distant, but something else entirely, something that belonged more to the man than the title he carried, and the room responded to that change in its own quiet way, the tension easing, the air feeling less like something waiting to break and more like something that had already been reshaped, and for a few seconds, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed explanation, only something that needed to be recognized, and when Dominic finally broke the silence, His voice carried that recognition clearly, not softened, not emotional, but grounded in something real. They are sleeping, and it was not a statement of fact, it was an acknowledgment of what had been accomplished, of what had been prevented, and Aisha nodded once, her eyes still on the children, because that was the only answer that mattered, and in that quiet exchange, something settled between them, not agreement, not understanding, but a shared awareness that what had happened in this room could not be undone, and as Dominic adjusted his hold once more, ensuring each child remained secure, his gaze lifted again, meeting hers with a steadiness that had replaced the sharpness from before, and when he spoke again, the words were simple. But they carried more weight than anything he had said since entering, "Stay," and the room did not react, did not shift or echo, but the meaning of that single word settled into every corner, rewriting the boundaries that had once defined her place in this house, and Aisha felt it, not as relief, not as triumph, but as something quieter, something more enduring, the understanding that this was no longer just a moment she had stepped into, but a role she had been pulled into, one that would not end when she walked out of this room, because she was not being asked to return to what she had been before, she was being told, without ceremony or explanation, that she was now part of what came next. The word lingered in the air long after it was spoken, not loud, not repeated, yet impossible to ignore, and Aisha felt it settle into her chest with a weight she had not expected, because it was not a request, not even an order in the way she had come to understand them in this house. It was something else entirely, something that carried permanence without explanation, and she remained where she was for a moment, her hand still slightly raised from where she had just released the children. Her body caught between the instinct to step back into invisibility and the quiet understanding that invisibility no longer applied to her, and Dominic did not look away, did not shift his attention elsewhere as he might have with any other staff member. Instead he adjusted his hold on the three children again, more confidently now, as if already adapting to a role he had not anticipated taking on in this way. His movements careful, deliberate, guided by something deeper than instruction, and for a brief second, the image stood in contrast to everything the house represented, the man who controlled every corner of this place now standing still in the center of a nursery, holding what mattered most without delegation, without distance, and Aisha saw it, recognized it not as softness but as something far more complex, something that did not erase who he was but revealed a part of him that had been left untested until now, and the room remained quiet, but no longer tense, the kind of silence that followed resolution rather than conflict. And then Dominic turned slightly toward the crib, not to return the children immediately, but to ensure the space was ready, his eyes scanning the arrangement with a sharper awareness than before, noticing what had been overlooked, the misplaced blankets, the unused monitor, the subtle signs that no one had been here when they should have been, and that awareness did not stay contained within the room, it extended beyond it, into something larger, something that would not remain unaddressed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that shift clearly, not raised, not forceful, but carrying a certainty that did not invite delay. No one enters this room unless she is here, and the statement did not need to name Aisha directly, because the meaning was unmistakable, and she felt it land in a way that went beyond instruction. It redefined her position entirely, not as someone who served the house, but as someone now tied to its most protected space. And for a moment, she did not respond, not out of hesitation, but because the weight of what had just been placed on her could not be acknowledged with something as simple as words, and Dominic did not wait for one, because his attention had already shifted to the next step, moving toward the crib and lowering himself just enough to place the children down one by one, each movement controlled, careful to preserve the calm that had been built, and Aisha stepped closer without being told, her hands instinctively adjusting the blankets, ensuring each child was settled properly, their positions secure, their breathing undisturbed. And for the first time since the night had begun, they moved in quiet coordination, not as employer and employee, but as two people focused on the same outcome, their actions aligned without needing instruction, and when the last child was placed gently into the crib, Dominic remained there for a second longer, his hand resting lightly against the edge as he looked down at them, not as an observer, but as someone who had just witnessed something he could not ignore, and Aisha stood beside him, her presence no longer something hidden or secondary, but part of the moment itself, and when he straightened, his posture returned, not fully to what it had been before, but closer, as if the weight of responsibility had settled back onto his shoulders in a new form, and he turned toward the door, pausing just briefly as if considering something, then speaking without looking back. "You will be informed of everything concerning them," and the words were precise, structured, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed, but beneath that structure was something else, something that acknowledged her role not as temporary, but as necessary, and Aisha nodded once, her voice quiet but steady when she answered, "Yes, sir," and it was not submission that shaped her tone, but acceptance, the kind that came from understanding exactly what had changed, and Dominic opened the door then, the hallway beyond no longer silent as distant movement resumed, but the space behind him, the nursery, remained untouched by that noise, holding on to the calm that had been fought for and secured, and as he stepped out, leaving the door slightly open behind him, Aisha remained where she was, her eyes returning to the crib, to the 3 children now sleeping peacefully, their small chests rising and falling in quiet rhythm, and she felt it then, not relief, not exhaustion, but something steadier, something that settled deep and did not move, the understanding that this night had not ended anything, it had begun something that would not be undone, because in a house where rules defined everything, one decision had rewritten them all, and she had been the one to make it. Morning did not arrive gently in the Russo mansion, it arrived with precision, with the quiet movement of staff returning to their routines, with polished shoes against marble floors and hushed voices that carried just enough to signal awareness without inviting attention. But inside the nursery, time moved differently, slower, steadier, untouched by the rhythm of the rest of the house, and Aisha remained there, not because she had been told to stay again, but because leaving no longer felt like an option she could take without consequence, her position now tied to the 3 small lives resting in the crib, their breathing still even, their bodies finally at peace after a night that had demanded more from her than any job ever had, and as the soft light of early morning filtered through the curtains, casting a muted glow across the room, she adjusted the blankets once more, her movements quiet, deliberate, ensuring nothing disturbed what had been so carefully restored, and it was in that stillness that the first shift of the new reality became visible, not through words, but through behavior, because when the door opened this time, it was not abrupt, not authoritative, it was careful, almost hesitant, as if whoever stood outside understood that this space no longer belonged to routine alone, and a staff member stepped in, pausing just inside the doorway, their eyes moving quickly from the crib to Aisha, then back again, waiting, not acting, and that hesitation spoke louder than any instruction ever could. Because in a house where orders were followed instantly, waiting meant something had changed, and Aisha did not acknowledge it directly, did not assert anything verbally, but the way she remained where she was, the way her presence did not shift or shrink, made the boundary clear without needing explanation, and after a moment, the staff member gave a small nod, stepping back out without a word, the door closing softly behind them, and the silence that followed was different now, no longer empty, no longer uncertain, but defined, structured around something new, and Aisha felt it settle into her posture, into the way she stood, into the way she looked at the crib not as something she was assigned to clean around, but as something she was responsible for, and that difference reshaped everything, because responsibility was not given lightly in this house, and yet it had been placed on her without negotiation, without ceremony, and as the minutes passed, the children began to stir. Not with distress, not with urgency, but with the natural rhythm of waking, small movements, soft sounds that carried none of the strain from the night before, and Aisha moved closer instinctively, her presence steady, her hands ready before the first full cry could form, and when one of them opened his eyes, blinking slowly in the soft light, his gaze did not search the room in confusion. It settled, almost immediately, on her, and that recognition, quiet and simple, carried more weight than anything that had been said since the night began, because it confirmed what had already been shown, that trust had formed in a space where it had been absent, and as the other 2 began to wake as well, their movements small, their sounds soft, Aisha responded with the same care, the same attention, guiding them through the transition from sleep to wakefulness without disruption, her voice low, her presence constant, and outside the room, the house continued its routine, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the shift that had taken place within these walls, until footsteps approached again, heavier this time, more deliberate, and the door opened once more, revealing Dominic standing there, not in the same position as the night before, not arriving into crisis, but stepping into a space that had already been redefined, and his eyes moved immediately to the crib, to the children now awake and calm, then to Aisha, taking in the scene without surprise, without question, because whatever had needed to be understood had already been decided, and he stepped inside fully, the door closing behind him as he observed for a moment longer, the subtle coordination between her movements and their responses, the absence of tension, the presence of something that could not be manufactured or instructed, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority, but now it rested on something steadier, something grounded in what he had already seen. They did not cry, and it was not a question, not even an observation, it was a recognition of difference, of change, and Aisha met his gaze briefly before answering, no, and that single word held the entire night within it, everything that had been prevented, everything that had been restored, and Dominic nodded once, not in approval, not in gratitude, but in acknowledgment, the kind that did not need to be repeated, and as he stepped closer, his attention shifting once more to the children, the room did not tense, did not prepare for disruption, it remained steady, because the balance had already been established, and nothing in that moment suggested it would be broken. Dominic did not reach for them immediately this time, and that difference, subtle but undeniable, carried more meaning than anything he had said, because the man who had walked into the nursery the night before ready to take control now stood still, watching, observing, allowing the moment to exist without interrupting it, and Aisha noticed, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the quiet awareness she had developed over hours of reading the space around her, and she continued what she was doing without hesitation, lifting one of the children carefully, supporting his head as she brought him closer, her movements steady, practiced now through repetition rather than instruction, and the child responded without resistance, settling into her hold as if it were the most natural place to be, and Dominic saw that, not as an outsider, but as someone measuring something deeper than routine, something that could not be taught or assigned, and for a long second, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to question, only something left to acknowledge, and when he finally moved, it was not to take over, not to replace her, but to step beside her. Close enough to see clearly, close enough to feel the quiet rhythm of the room that had been established without him, and his gaze shifted between the children and Aisha, taking in the small details that now defined everything, the way they did not flinch at sound, the way their breathing remained even, the way their focus returned to her without searching, and that consistency settled into him in a way that required no explanation, because it answered the only question that mattered, and when he spoke, his voice did not carry command this time, it carried recognition. They chose you, and the words landed without resistance, without doubt, because they were not an opinion. They were a fact made visible through every small action in the room, and Aisha paused for just a second, not in surprise, but in the weight of hearing something she had already understood spoken aloud, and she did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to add, nothing to defend, only something to accept, and Dominic remained where he was, his presence no longer altering the space in a disruptive way, but integrating into it, adapting to something he had not controlled, and after a moment, he reached out again, not to take, but to connect, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the crib as he looked down at the other two children, their eyes now open, calm, aware, and one of them shifted slightly, turning his head toward Aisha even as Dominic stood closer, and that small movement carried more weight than any declaration could have, because it confirmed what had already been said without words, and Dominic exhaled slowly, not as frustration, not as resignation, but as understanding, the kind that came when something undeniable replaced everything else. And he straightened slightly, his posture returning not to what it had been before, but to something adjusted, something that accounted for what he had just accepted, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that adjustment clearly. From today forward, they answer to you, and the statement was not symbolic, it was absolute, the kind of decision that reshaped structure without needing explanation, and Aisha felt it settle into her in a way that was both grounding and heavy, because this was not temporary, not conditional. It was a shift that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room, into everything that would follow, and she nodded once, not as submission, but as acknowledgment of what had been placed in her hands, and Dominic held her gaze for a second longer, ensuring the meaning had been understood, then turned toward the door, pausing just briefly before stepping out, and as the door closed behind him, the nursery remained exactly as it was, steady, quiet, unchanged in its new reality. And Aisha looked down at the three children once more, their small faces turned toward her, their presence no longer fragile in the same way it had been the night before, but anchored now in something stronger, something built through choice rather than obligation, and she adjusted her hold slightly, supporting them with the same care that had brought them through the night, and the room did not shift, did not echo, it simply held the truth of what had happened, and in that quiet, without announcement or ceremony, everything that had once defined power in that house had been rewritten, not by force, not by authority, but by the simple act of someone refusing to walk away, and that day, without anyone needing to say it out loud, the world inside those walls remembered what dignity looked like.